From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The Republican Party is desperate right now. Voter suppression is their main strategy, and the way they want to carry out voter suppression is by packing the courts, in particular the Supreme Court, so they uphold that suppression and install Donald Trump for a second term.
A record-shattering 76 million people have already voted in person or by mail in the U.S. election. But the battle over the counting of mail-in ballots continues. The Supreme Court is allowing Pennsylvania and North Carolina, for now, to count ballots received after Election Day, but the High Court could still hear the Pennsylvania case after the election, and it could decide who wins the presidency. We'll speak to Mother Jones' Ari Berman. Then we look at big tech's role in the election as Senate Republicans accuse social media companies of favoring Democrats. But is it true?
If anything, we see many sorts of technology platforms throughout the past 4 years supporting the Trump agenda and the conservative agenda.
And as millions plunge into pandemic poverty, the Senate has adjourned before passing another stimulus bill. We'll look at the spike in hunger across the United States.
So these families are living basically like on a ticking time bomb. Like when this starts up again, how they're going to pay for their rent.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States recorded more than 80,000 new coronavirus infections Wednesday and over 1,000 new deaths, as the White House Coronavirus Task Force warned in an internal report of unrelenting broad community spread in the Midwest, upper Midwest and West, unquote. Every state in the union is either holding steady or seeing an increase in new cases, with the U.S. headed for a third surge that's set to rival two previous peaks. On the campaign trail, President Trump continues to rally his supporters at packed events where few people wear masks. On Wednesday, Trump traveled to Arizona, where he mocked a statewide mask mandate ordered by California's Governor Gavin Newsom.
In California, you have a special mask. You cannot, under any circumstances, take it off. You have to eat through the mask.
Trump's remarks came as a new study by Vanderbilt University researchers found coronavirus hospitalizations rose dramatically in places without a local mask mandate compared to places where a large majority of people wear face coverings in public. On Wednesday, top infectious disease scientist Dr. Anthony Fauci made his strongest comments yet in favor of a nationwide mask mandate.
Let's put aside these extraordinary excuses for not doing it when we're dealing with a situation that's not trivial. You know, we have 225,000 deaths. The modeling tells us we're going to get 100 or more thousand as we get into the winter. That is just something that's unacceptable.
Meanwhile, new audio has emerged of President Trump's son-in-law, senior advisor Jared Kushner, bragging about Trump's decision to ignore the advice of his top public health officials early in the pandemic. Kushner was speaking with journalist Bob Woodward on April 18th.
You know, it was almost like Trump getting the country back from the doctors, right, in the sense that what he now did was, you know, he's going to own the open up.
Last week, a study in the journal Nature Medicine found universal mask wearing across the United States could save nearly 130,000 lives by the end of next February. The University of Wisconsin's canceled Saturday's football game at the University of Nebraska after 6 players and 6 staffers, including head coach Paul Chryst, tested positive for coronavirus. The team's outbreak came as the state of Wisconsin set a record-high coronavirus test positivity rate of more than 27%, with hospitalizations more than doubling over the last month. Meanwhile, Major League Baseball sharply criticized Los Angeles Dodgers third baseman baseman Justin Turner Wednesday after he returned to the field just hours after testing positive for coronavirus. Turner was pulled from Game 6 of the World Series during the 8th inning Tuesday evening, but then returned to celebrate after the Dodgers clinched the series, taking a turn hoisting the World Series trophy overhead and even removing his face mask to pose with photos with teammates. In a statement, Major League Baseball promised an investigation, adding, quote, "While a desire to celebrate is understandable, Turner's decision to leave isolation and enter the field was wrong and put everyone he came in contact with at risk," unquote. French President Emmanuel Macron has ordered a nationwide lockdown for the second time since the pandemic began, after France registered more than 30,000 coronavirus cases Wednesday for the third day in a row.
Like in the spring, you will be able to leave your house only to work, for a medical appointment, to provide assistance to a relative, to shop for essential goods, or to get some air near your house. This means the return of the permission slip.
Germany said it will close restaurants, bars, gyms, and theaters for a month, but will keep schools and daycare centers open after a massive second wave of infections pushed daily case counts and hospitalizations to record highs. Iran reported a record death toll for a second straight day Wednesday, with fresh warnings that the nation's healthcare system, already strained by U.S. sanctions, could collapse. In Latin America, Mexico's passed 900,000 confirmed coronavirus cases and over 90,000 deaths, while Argentina continues to set records for infections, with 1 out of every 44 people confirmed to have acquired the virus. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled the states of Pennsylvania and North Carolina can accept absentee ballots received after November 3rd, at least for now. In the Pennsylvania case, the justices refused to take up a plea from Republicans to overturn a ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to count ballots received up until 3 days after the election if they're postmarked by November 3rd. But the justices could still consider the Republican challenge again after the election if the state turns out to be pivotal in the election. In the North Carolina case, the justices let stand a lower court ruling allowing the state's Board of Elections to extend the deadline for counting ballots to 9 days after Election Day. Newly confirmed Justice Amy Coney Barrett did not take part in either case. The International Crisis Group, which monitors conflict around the world, is warning of possible violence in the United States during voting or the vote-counting process. The group cited growing political polarization, the rise of armed groups, and the higher-than-usual chances of a contested election outcome. But the International Crisis Group says the most important risk factor is the president himself. In a new report, the group writes President Trump, quote, "toxic rhetoric and willingness to court conflict to advance his personal interests have no precedent in modern U.S. history," they said. In Nebraska, hundreds of Trump supporters were left stranded in the freezing cold for hours at an airfield in Omaha Tuesday night following a rally by President Trump. At least 7 people were taken to the hospital. One 68-year-old man was found shivering with possible hypothermia and altered mental status, according to an account by the Omaha police scanner. The rally was held 3 miles from the closest parking lot, and the Trump campaign did not have enough buses to transport everyone in a timely manner. Former Homeland Security official Miles Taylor has revealed he was the Trump administration insider who first critiqued the president in 2018 in the New York Times under the pen name Anonymous. The Times described Anonymous as a senior official in the Trump administration, prompting speculation the article may have been written by a member of Trump's cabinet. At the time, Taylor was an advisor to then Homeland Security Director Kirstjen Nielsen. In August, Taylor endorsed Joe Biden for president. Virginia Governor Ralph Northam has signed several police reform bills limiting the militarization of police departments and banning the use of no-knock warrants, joining Florida and Oregon as the 3rd state to bar unannounced raids by police. Virginia House Bill 5099 was nicknamed Breonna's Law after Breonna Taylor, the 26-year-old black woman shot to death in her own home last March by Louisville, Kentucky police officers serving a no-knock warrant. In Philadelphia, federal agents arrested prominent civil rights activist Anthony Smith at his home Wednesday over unspecified charges related to protests against police brutality that erupted in May. Smith's lawyers are questioning the timing of the arrests, which came as protests continued against the police killing of Walter Wallace Jr., a 27-year-old black man who was shot and killed by 2 Philadelphia officers during a mental health crisis this week. Philadelphia's mayor ordered a curfew overnight following incidents of arson and looting on the sidelines of mostly peaceful protests on Monday and Tuesday. Meanwhile, Philadelphia's police department says it has launched an investigation into officers who were filmed smashing the windows of an SUV during protests early Tuesday morning, then beating the driver and removing a small child from the back seat. On the Gulf Coast, at least 2 people were killed Wednesday after Hurricane Zeta made landfall south of New Orleans as a Category 2 storm. Zeta moved rapidly inland, leaving more than 1.7 million customers without power between Louisiana and the Carolinas. It was the 5th named storm to make landfall in Louisiana this year, the strongest hurricane since 1899 to hit the U.S. this late in the year, and the 27th named storm of 2020's unprecedented climate-fueled Atlantic hurricane season. The Trump administration has stripped protections against logging and road building in the Tongass National Forest in Alaska, one of the world's largest temperate rainforests. The 9.3 million-acre forest is home to pristine, old-growth trees and vulnerable species, including Pacific salmon, wolves, and bears. This month, the Natural Resources Defense Council noted the Tongass, quote, stores more carbon per acre than almost any other forest on the planet, which makes preserving it a matter of real urgency in the fight against climate change, unquote. The International Red Cross warns fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh region risks spiraling out of control as civilian casualties mount. On Wednesday, Armenia accused Azerbaijan of bombing a maternity hospital in Stepanakert. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan claims 21 people died after Armenian forces shelled the town of Barda. In Colombia, riot police used tear gas and truncheons Wednesday to force more than 600 indigenous families from their homes on privately owned land in the southern Amazonas region. The area is one of Colombia's poorest, and residents say poverty drove them to occupy the property 2 months ago in a desperate bid for survival.
If the police are going to evict me, then kill me first. But I tell you, I am not going. I am not going.
Back in the United States, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has agreed to pay $100,000 in damages to settle a lawsuit for targeting members of the Vermont-based group Migrant Justice. Under the agreement, ICE will also stop deportation proceedings against 3 members of Migrant Justice, including Victor Diaz, who spoke in Burlington at a rally Wednesday.
ICE tried to terrorize us by going after our leaders. They tried to divide us by going after our organization. They tried to silence us. But with this settlement, we are saying that we will not be silenced.
To see our interviews with members of Migrant Justice, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. And in news from the art world, the Baltimore Museum of Art has called off plans to sell 3 paintings, including an Andy Warhol, to raise money to buy more art by women and artists of color. The museum was hoping to raise $65 million from the auction and sale, but the move set off a fierce debate within Baltimore and the art community. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, a record-shattering 76 million people have already voted in person or by mail in the 2020 election. But the battle over the counting of mail-in ballots continues. On Wednesday, the Supreme Court decided 2 major related cases, ruling swing states Pennsylvania and North Carolina can accept absentee ballots in the days following Election Day, well, at least for now. In the Pennsylvania case, the justices refused to take up a plea from Republicans to overturn a ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to count ballots received up until 3 days after the election if they're postmarked by November 3rd. But the justices could still consider the Republican challenge again after the election. All ballots received after November 3rd will be segregated from other ballots. In the North Carolina case, the justices let stand a lower court ruling allowing the state's Board of Elections to extend the deadline for counting ballots to 9 days after Election Day. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who was just sworn in this week, did not take part in either case. The rulings follow the Supreme Court's Monday 5-3 decision that mail-in ballots in Wisconsin can be counted only if they're received by Election Day. Justice Brett Kavanaugh joined the conservative majority, writing a concurring opinion that alarmed voting rights advocates after he claimed counting ballots received after Election Day could create, quote, suspicions of impropriety because they could potentially flip the results of an election, he wrote. In a rare move, Kavanaugh changed a line in his opinion Wednesday after facing criticism for falsely saying that the state of Vermont had not changed its voting rules due to the pandemic. Kavanaugh issued a revised opinion changing the phrase ordinary election rules to ordinary election deadline rules. He made the change without comment or explanation, but it came after Vermont's Secretary of State, Jim Condos, tweeted he'd formally requested a correction to what he called the, quote, erroneous claim by Justice Kavanaugh that Vermont has not changed voting procedures for the 2020 elections due to COVID-19. When it comes to issuing decisions on the voting rights of American citizens, facts matter, the Vermont Secretary of State wrote. This is Condos in an interview earlier on CNN.
Policymakers should consider extending these deadlines given the massive volume of absentee ballots we're going to get. Some states have done that. Most states have not. Most states do still require absentee ballots to be received by election night to be treated as valid votes.
For more on the significance of the Supreme Court rulings and how early voting is playing out across the country, we're joined by Ari Berman, senior writer at Mother Jones, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. His latest Mother Jones piece, Brett Kavanaugh lays out a plan to help Trump steal the election. Ari, welcome back to Democracy Now! Explain these Supreme Court decisions that just took place yesterday and in the last few days.
Hi, Amy. Good to be back. So there were a flurry of decisions from the Supreme Court, and it's very unusual for the Supreme Court to be hearing cases about voting rules in which tens of millions of people are already voting, and the election day is only a week away. And so there were three major rulings. In Wisconsin, the Supreme Court said that ballots must be received by Election Day. But in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, they essentially said the opposite, which is that in Pennsylvania, ballots postmarked by Election Day could be received 3 days after. In North Carolina, ballots postmarked by Election Day could be received up to 9 days after. But these victories are only preliminary victories. In the Pennsylvania case, Samuel Alito basically said Pennsylvania Republicans should try to challenge this after the election. We might throw those ballots out, which is stunning. That you have a justice on the Supreme Court basically saying, come back to us and we'll throw those votes out that are going to be disproportionately cast by Democrats. They're going to be legal under Pennsylvania law. And so my message to voters in these states and other states is drop your ballot off. It's too late to mail your ballots back in states like Wisconsin that have Election Day deadlines, and 30 states have a deadline of Election Day for when your ballot has to be received. But even if you live in a state like Pennsylvania and North Carolina, don't leave it to chance that your vote can be thrown out. If you drop your ballot off, or if you vote early in person or on Election Day, there is certainty that your votes will be counted. You do not have that same certainty given the composition of the Supreme Court with ballots arriving after Election Day.
Recent article you wrote that Republican efforts at voter suppression may actually be backfiring. Could you explain?
Yeah, and I mean, that could be a really fascinating subplot to this election. Voter suppression has been the dominant storyline of the election, the efforts to make it harder to vote. But I do believe it's having a backlash in terms of motivating Democrats and voters of color to show up in record numbers. Trump has been so brazen about the suppression, talking about sabotaging the post office so people won't be able to vote by mail, saying he won't commit to a peaceful transfer of power, saying he doesn't want votes to be counted. And then at the local level, things like in Texas, where the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, said that there can only be one location to drop your mail ballots off per county. So that in Harris County, Texas, instead of 12 places to drop your ballot off, there's only one in a county that has 2.4 million registered voters, is larger than the state of Rhode Island, and has more people than 26 states. Texas Democrats and Democrats across the country heard these messages, and they said, if Republicans are trying so hard to attack my right to vote must matter. And the most important thing for me to do is to vote in record numbers and to vote early so my votes can't be thrown out. So I believe the record turnout we're seeing all across the country, but particularly in states that have been hit hard by voter suppression, in Georgia, in Texas, is sparking a backlash from voters that are angry that their right to vote is under assault and are determined to make sure their votes are counted.
And could you talk, Ari, about some of your concerns regarding Amy Coney Barrett, her record on voting rights, and what role she might play in the event that this election is disputed, as many are anticipating it will be?
I'm extremely concerned about Amy Coney Barrett's record on voting rights. At her confirmation hearing, she refused to answer very basic questions about the protection of the right to vote. She refused to say whether voter intimidation is illegal, which it is. She refused to say whether the president of the United States had the power to delay the election, which he does not. She refused to acknowledge the continued existence of voter suppression, which everyone knows still exists. So she refused to answer these very, very basic questions about voting rights. She has written opinions in the past that are very concerning, saying, for example, that people with past felony convictions should be able to own guns but not be able to vote. And she comes at a moment when President Trump is saying that he wants her confirmed to the court so she can be the deciding vote to challenge the counting of ballots, which is just so incredibly disturbing in a democracy that you would appoint someone on the court with the express purpose of her not counting votes that are cast by your opponent. And so the prospect of her, first off, not recusing herself, even though she was confirmed just 8 days before the election, which at the time 60 million people had voted, but then the fact that she could be the deciding vote on one of these cases. And the last thing I'll say about Amy Coney Barrett is Amy Coney Barrett, Brett Kavanaugh, and John Roberts all worked on the Florida 2000 recount for George W. Bush. So they all have a track record of doing whatever it takes to count Republican votes, but stopping Democratic votes from counting. And that's exactly the situation President Trump wants to happen again.
And in addition to that, Ari, Clarence Thomas is the only remaining judge who gave the election to Bush in 2000. And you add to that these three Supreme Court justices, as you said, Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, who are veterans of the Bush legal team in 2000, Bush v. Gore. So to get to 5, they only need one more vote. And you've got the ultra-conservatives Gorsuch and Alito.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's not hard to imagine another Bush v. Gore scenario. And the really shocking thing about Brett Kavanaugh's opinion in the Wisconsin case, which was so sloppy and so inaccurate, was that he actually cited Bush v. Gore in his opinion. And the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore explicitly said, don't cite this as a precedent. So Kavanaugh not only cited the case as a precedent when the Supreme Court said not to, it had only been cited once in 20 years by Clarence Thomas. And then Brett Kavanaugh, who worked on the Florida 2000 recount for George W. Bush, cites Bush v. Gore as a precedent for potentially throwing out Democratic votes in the future. So they've been very open about their plans here. The Republican Party wants to rerun Bush versus Gore. They want to litigate this election in every way possible, and they want to throw out votes cast by Democrats, and they want the Supreme Court to once again declare a Republican president the winner of the election. I think that would lead to the biggest legitimacy crisis in American politics in our history, at least in our modern history. And so everyone needs to be aware of what the Supreme Court is trying to do, and they need to vote in record numbers. They need to vote in record numbers early so they can't challenge these late arriving ballots or other things like they want to do.
Ari, I wanted to correct something in our lead. We misidentified Vermont's Secretary of State James Kondos, who, of course, wrote to Kavanaugh to correct his concurring opinion early in the week. The person who actually spoke on CNN was NYU professor Richard Pildes. But it was Kondos who demanded a correction and got one from Kavanaugh. Talk about the significance of that and how rare that is.
It's just so incredibly sloppy. I mean, Supreme Court justices have clerks for a reason, and they're supposed to be factual in their analysis. And not only was Brett Kavanaugh wrong on the merits of this Wisconsin case, he was factually inaccurate. He said, for example, that states like Vermont had not changed their election procedures in response to COVID, when in fact Vermont has sent ballots to all registered voters to make it very, very easy to vote by mail, which is the very kind of thing that the Trump campaign is opposing. And so I believe that Brett Kavanaugh's opinion in this Wisconsin case was a form of election interference. He was trying to delegitimize the counting of votes, because the most disturbing part of Brett Kavanaugh's opinion, in addition to all the factual errors, was when he said that votes counted after Election Day could lead to suspicions of impropriety. That's simply not true. Every single state counts votes after Election Day. Votes are not certified until at least a week after the election in nearly every state of the country. Military ballots frequently come in after Election Day. And in fact, during the Florida 2000 recount, Brett Kavanaugh took the position that military ballots, which lean Republican, should be counted in Florida even after they arrived after Election Day. So Kavanaugh's making a completely different argument now than he made during the 2000 Florida recount for George W. Bush. There's no consistency, and he is laying the groundwork to help President Trump try to steal the election. And that is absolutely chilling that a Supreme Court justice would do that.
And Ari, what will you be watching most closely on November 3rd? And what do you think we'll know by the end of the night?
So many things, Nermeen, where to start? I mean, obviously, I'm going to see what the turnout is like. So many people have voted early already that we don't know how many people are actually going to show up on Election Day. I'm going to see how many people were, for example, planning to vote by mail, but didn't get their mail ballots and so had to vote on Election Day. I'm going to see what the lines look like. I'm going to see whether there's voter intimidation, whether the Trump administration or vigilante groups are trying to challenge people's right to vote at the polls. And then I'm going to see how long it takes to count the votes. In some states, like in Arizona and Florida, they start in North Carolina, they start counting votes early. But in the three most important battleground states, in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, they cannot start counting votes early. Michigan, they can start a day earlier, but Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, they can't actually start counting votes until Election Day, meaning it's going to take some time. It might take a day, 2 days, 3 days. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, they say they probably will have results by the Friday after the election. So we're not going to have a quote-unquote election night in the traditional sense of the word. It's going to take a little bit longer. And the message from the media has to be, we need to count all the votes, and it's more important to get it right than to do it quickly, and that Donald Trump or any other candidate doesn't have the power to prematurely declare themselves the winner of the election. This is done at the state and local level. It's going to take a little bit of time, and we're just going to have to adjust to that new reality.
And I want to let people know that we're going to be doing a special on Tuesday night, November 3rd, from 9 Eastern Time until midnight. Not clear that any final results will be in, though maybe a number of other down-ballot races will be in. That's 9 to midnight. You can catch it at DemocracyNow.org or possibly your local station, wherever you're watching Democracy Now! Will be airing it as well. But Ari Berman, we have one last question for you that doesn't exactly relate to, though kind of, the elections. We're about to turn to a segment on big tech. The CEOs were grilled Wednesday on Capitol Hill about how they moderate election disinformation and extremist content. They were accused by Republicans of censoring conservatives. But before we go, I wanted to ask you about how Facebook designed changes to its news feed algorithm in 2017 to reduce the visibility of progressive news sites like Mother Jones, your news organization. According to the Wall Street Journal, some policy executives at Facebook voiced concerns in 2017 about pending changes to the news feed algorithm that they thought might have a larger impact on right-leaning news sites like the Daily Wire. So engineers made changes to the algorithm that would have a bigger impact on the traffic to left-leaning sites. Meanwhile, Mother Jones editors wrote in 2019 the site had seen a sharp decline in its Facebook audience, which translated to a loss of around $600,000 over 18 months. And apparently, according to the Wall Street Journal, Zuckerberg himself signed off on these changes. Your comments?
It's incredibly disturbing. It's an attack on democracy. It's an attack on freedom of the press. It's an attack on the progressive movement. Facebook is not censoring conservatives. It's boosting conservatives. It's censoring progressives. It's censoring independent media. And the fact that we are trying to do everything we can to get the truth out, and Facebook is deliberately sabotaging our readership, is so disturbing. At the same time that Facebook is spreading all of this disinformation by conservatives, by President Trump. So you have a situation where things that are manifestly untrue by President Trump, by right-wing media, are getting huge boosts on Facebook. But efforts by Mother Jones and other publications to counter that disinformation, to tell people what's really going on, to report the facts, that is being censored. So this is a huge scandal for democracy. This is a huge scandal for the media. Facebook needs to be held accountable for this. And I believe if there's a new administration and a new Congress, they are going to take a very hard look at Facebook's policies and how it's deliberately censored publications like Mother Jones, because this is an attack on democracy, an attack on freedom of the press.
Ari Berman, thanks so much for being with us, senior writer at Mother Jones, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. And we'll link to your piece at Mother Jones' website. Brett Kavanaugh lays out a plan to help Trump steal the election. When we come back, yes, we will look more at how big tech's role in the election as Senate Republicans accuse social media companies of favoring Democrats, and Democrats also took on the CEOs. But is that true? Stay with us. Americanos by Mana. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Just days ahead of Election Day, chief executives of Facebook, Google, and Twitter were grilled on Capitol Hill about how they moderate hate speech, extremist content, and election disinformation, including tweets from President Trump. The Senate Commerce Committee hearing was officially about, quote, how best to preserve the Internet as a forum for open discourse and whether to change a decades-old law known as Section 230 that protects Internet companies from legal liability for content generated by its users. But most Republican senators focused on allegations that the platform systematically censor conservatives. This is Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas questioning Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey.
Mr. Dorsey, who the hell elected you and put you in charge of what the media are allowed to report and what the American people are allowed to hear? And why do you persist in behaving as a Democratic super PAC, silencing views to the contrary of your political beliefs?
We're not doing that. And this is why I opened this hearing with calls for more transparency. We realize we need to earn trust more. We realize that more accountability is needed to show our intentions and to show the outcomes.
That's Republican Senator Ted Cruz questioning Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey virtually. This is Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah questioning Google CEO Sundar Pichai.
Can you name for me one high-profile person or entity from a liberal ideology who you have censored and what particular action you took?
We have, turned down ads from Priorities USA, from Vice President Biden's campaign. We have had compliance issues with World Socialist Review, which is a left-leaning publication. We can give you several examples.
There is a disparity between the censorship, and again, I'm using that as a term of art as I've defined it a moment ago, between the censorship of conservative and liberal points of view. And it's an enormous disparity.
That's Republican Utah Senator Mike Lee questioning Google CEO Sundar Pichai. This comes as the progressive news organization Mother Jones recently reported Facebook tweaked its code to help right-wing publishers and throttle left-leaning sites. The Wall Street Journal reported Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg personally approved the plans. At Wednesday's hearing, Democrats accused Republicans of politicizing the hearing and questioned the three tech executives about their efforts to stop the spread of viral disinformation. This is Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota questioning Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg.
I want to note first that this hearing comes 6 days before Election Day, and it makes, I believe, we're politicizing, and the Republican majority is politicizing, which should actually not be a partisan topic. When John McCain and I and Senator Warner introduced the Honest Ads Act, we got pushback from your company, others, and you were initially against it. Then we discussed this at a hearing. You're for it. I appreciate that. And have you spent any of the money? I know you spent the most money. Facebook spent the most money ever lobbying last year. Have you spent any of the money trying to change or block the bill?
Senator, no. In fact, I've endorsed it publicly, and we've implemented it into our systems, even though it hasn't become law. I'm a big supporter.
Have you done anything in the past to try to change it? No. Have you done anything to get it passed? Because we're at a roadblock on it. And I do appreciate that you voluntarily implemented some of it, but have you voluntarily implemented the part of the Honest Ads Act where you fully disclose which groups of people are being targeted by political ads?
Senator, we have, I think, industry-leading transparency around political ads, and part of that is showing which audiences, in broad terms, ended up seeing the ads. Of course, getting the right resolution on that is challenging without it becoming a privacy issue, but we've tried to do that and provide as much transparency as we can, and I think we're currently leading in that area.
Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook. Well, for more, we're joined by Ramesh Srinivasan, professor of information studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he directs the Digital Cultures Lab. He's the author of the book Beyond the Valley: How Innovators Around the World Are Overcoming Inequality and Creating the Technologies of Tomorrow. Professor, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Why don't you first summarize this hearing and what you think is most critical, what was raised and what we think was most problematic?
Here. I think what we see is astonishing timing being pushed forward by the Republicans and the administration. Note, Democracy Now! Itself covered this just a few days ago, the antitrust or the regulatory potential action pushed forward by the Department of Justice against Google just a few days ago. But what we see occurring is a certain set of talking points which might be used by the Republicans and the administration as a basis for making claims to invalidate the election. There are claims being made for years without any basis or evidence by President Trump that Google is responsible for millions of votes being cast against the Republicans, against him in 2016. So basically what we see coming from the Republicans is this argument that lacks any evidence, quite frankly, that there are systematic biases in terms of censorship as well as algorithmic bias that skew against conservative talking points and conservative perspectives, when in fact, in reality, the opposite is exactly what is true. The Democrats, on the other hand, are trying to look at Section 230, which sort of is a proposal in the Communications Decency Act that regulates the extremist content. It normalizes it. It allows certain types of content to be able to be present on online platforms that may not be on other media channels, such as Democracy Now! Itself.
And Ramesh, Senator John Tester, who spoke at yesterday's hearing, said the hearing had been called at the directive of the White House. Do you think that's plausible? And also the fact that Donald Trump has used so liberally, frequently, almost hourly, the social media platform Twitter. And Twitter just recently blocked a couple of his posts. So do you think that this hearing is driven in part by that decision?
Thank you for that question, Nermeen. Absolutely. It seems highly likely that that's possible because Twitter has long been praised by the president as his mouthpiece to, quote unquote, directly reaching the people. And we know that Twitter's algorithms, much like Facebook's, work to prioritize content that is likely to be sensational, that grabs people's attention. This is what the tech companies call maximizing audience engagement. So we know that social media technologies, which are basically designed to try to grab our attention as much as possible so they can maximize their ability to gather and extract data from us, are designed in a way to support the agendas of disinformation and the spectacle, really, that is put forth by this administration. So we have to ask very difficult questions about the timing of all of this and try to look at why. Why is this administration deciding to make this an issue right before the election? And I think there are very difficult questions and answers that we have to uncover related to that are politically motivated rather than evidence-based.
Do you think, Ramesh, on the basis of this hearing, that social media, big tech, might alter the way that it deals with any kind of election dispute that might come following November 3rd?
I'm certainly hopeful of that. Our big tech companies are private corporations that have monetized publicly funded investments that all of us have paid for as American taxpayers. And this is true across the board with other major corporate initiatives. I think it's extremely important moving forward that we have an expansive, progressive digital Bill of Rights where there's actual public governance and public audit of these tech platforms about how they make decisions, about whose data they gather. And we need real regulatory action to ensure that they serve the public interest because they actually rest on the backs of public subsidies and public investments. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to push forward real progressive advances in legislation on this issue.
And Professor Srinivasan, this issue of the timing of this hearing right before the election, kind of opening salvo of President Trump warning Google and other of the social media companies, the Department of Justice filing a major lawsuit against Google last week. Can you talk more about what this is laying the groundwork for in terms of invalidating the whole election?
It's potentially an explanation that can be used by the administration to make claims that the election was conducted under false pretenses because big tech is systematically biased against the president and his agenda. But nothing can be further from the truth, as we were just discussing. President Trump made the claim just over a year ago that Google cost him upwards of 10 million votes that were lost in his favor toward Hillary Clinton in 2016, and even a higher number in 2018. There is absolutely no evidence for this claim whatsoever. We know, if anything, when we look at the litany of examples of conspiracy theories that our reliance on big tech as we sit out this pandemic and future pandemics and climate crises, that these technology platforms, we are seeing again and again, and we see examples like Cambridge Analytica, foreign interference, disinformation. All of this has skewed toward conservative, fringe, and right-leaning content. So actually, if anything, the most spectacular disinformation, which fuels Trump's base and fuels the Trump agenda of disorientation and controversy, has skewed toward the right. So Trump has made these claims that are in fact the opposite of reality.
Ramesh, what does it mean also for social media giants like Facebook and Twitter to be making decisions about what content is permissible, what content should be promoted, and what content should be censored? Could you expand on what your Bill of Rights, digital Bill of Rights that you mentioned earlier, would change, and also the alternatives to the way in which these companies and the internet generally operate? You mentioned, for example, what's happened in Oaxaca in Mexico.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, what we've really seen occur is the private takeover of corporations that are valued at, you know, we're talking about nearly $1 trillion for each of these big tech companies, and in some cases more. All of this built upon the backs of American taxpayers, right? And so we see a pattern again and again where all of the costs are borne by society, all of the costs of private greed and a lack of accountability, and all of the profits, and in this case, incredible valuations, are privatized and are in the hands of shareholders. And so this is a great opportunity for us with this digital Bill of Rights, or just more expansive, progressive, peoples-based legislation, for us to really fight for a digital world that also returns value to all of us as citizens, but also all of us as workers, the working class, the middle class, and so on. And that is the opposite of what is occurring, Nermeen. What we see occurring are platitudes that are offered to us, generally speaking, by the tech companies. We see a little bit more movement by Jack Dorsey in this last round, but not a lot. We see tech companies pretending, private tech companies pretending like they are the internet, when in fact they are private corporations that rest on the backs of the internet. We saw Sundar Pichai from Google do that, you know, kind of make that kind of claim again and again. What they usually offer us is better AI, and we'll fix the problem in-house and we will be collaborative. But there's almost never any specifics. There's almost never any real transparency, as we just saw in these clips. There's almost never any audit. So what we need in a real progressive movement toward transforming tech in the public interest are things like digital public infrastructure. We need a universal jobs guarantee. We need AI systems, if they are to be used at all, to be built and designed by we, the people, especially groups like, for example, movements like Black Lives Matter should take power over whether we use facial recognition and AI technologies. So what we really need is a transference of power and governance in the hands of people. And so this gives us an opportunity, as we see big tech spectacularly fail again and again and again, and now be used as some sort of punching bag for this right-wing administration that relies on an absence of evidence. We have an opportunity to completely invert the system and transform it to support not just corporate welfare, but actually all of our interests as Americans. And we're talking about the wealthiest companies in the history of the world. We are reliant on big tech platforms and big tech companies more than ever, you know, as we sit out this pandemic, and we see handouts, not just by Republicans, but by Democratic administrations, as you all have covered on Democracy Now, to big tech companies, as if somehow we are just giving them a blank check without any governance or oversight or real accountability to just basically technologize our future in whatever ways they choose to do so.
Well, Ramesh Srinivasan, this is a conversation that we will continue at a future point. Professor Srinivasan teaches information studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he also directs the Digital Cultures Lab. He's author of the book, Beyond the Valley, How Innovators Around the World Are Overcoming Inequality and Creating the Technologies of Tomorrow. When we come back, as millions of Americans plunge into pandemic poverty, the Senate's adjourned before passing another stimulus bill. Stay with us.
You keep telling me stakes get higher. I've got the capitalist blues. When I give everything, I won't have much more to lose. I am swimming in an ocean of sharks. They are telling me how I'm gonna make my little mark in this cold, cold world. It can be such a cold, cold world.
The Capitalist Blues by Layla McCullough. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we continue to look at growing poverty in the United States. This week, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell adjourned the Senate without a new stimulus bill and won't reconvene until November 9th. President Trump said Tuesday any deal on a new relief package would have to wait until after the election. This comes as more than 54 million U.S. residents are struggling to afford food, according to the hunger relief organization Feeding America. And a new report finds more than 8 million people have been forced into poverty just since May. That's when the additional federal aid that kept millions afloat during the early months of the pandemic ended. Black and Latinx people, as well as children, have been particularly impacted. A new report finds the massive $2 trillion CARES Act, which sent households one-time payments and boosted unemployment checks with $600 additional a week through July, helped keep millions out of poverty. But since the additional aid has ended, the number of poor people has surged. For more, we're joined by Megan Curran, with the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. She has co-authored the report on increasing poverty rates in the U.S. during the pandemic. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Megan. It's great to have you with us. Just lay out the report's horrific findings.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. What myself and my colleagues at the Columbia Center on Poverty have been trying to do is track the real-time effect on families of the, continuing crisis. One of the biggest challenges is that the way we traditionally measure poverty in this country is on an annual basis, and there's usually a time delay. So that's imperfect in normal times, but we know that 2020 is far from normal. And so it's something that calls for new tools. What we've tried to do most recently is estimate the monthly poverty rates in the U.S., so trying to look at what happened when families went out of work very sharply, but also what happened when the federal relief came in. And we found three main things. The first is that Congress did the right thing early on with the CARES Act in particular, the stimulus checks and the expanded unemployment benefits. The combination prevented what could have basically been the worst spike in poverty in 50 years. The second thing, however, is the bad news, which is that these successes are quickly being lost. The relief was temporary, and much of it has now expired. And so now we're seeing poverty rise again. But the third piece is kind of a silver lining in that we know what works now, getting cash out to households directly. And so we know that families can be protected again, but it does require action at the federal level.
And Megan, can you talk specifically about the impact of this poverty on children? 2.5 million children have been pushed into poverty since May. Is that right?
Yeah. So, the important thing to note is that, child poverty in the U.S., even before the crisis hit, was high and, arguably much too high for as wealthy a nation as we are. In the years coming up to it, even when the economy appeared strong, we had, more than 13 million children living below the poverty line. And just to put that in context, that's, we're talking about trying to get by on about $28,000 a year for a family of four, if you're in sort of an average cost city. And so it's not a generous level that we're talking about, but so many children were already living below that number, and we have now seen, another 2.5 million children fall below that income level just since May. And we know that also it's not hitting all kids equally. The gap in poverty, is stark between for Black and Latino children. It's 2.5 times higher than it is for whites, for white children. And so we need to, recognize that this was a problem beforehand, but it has been seriously exacerbated. It has been seriously magnified by this crisis.
And Megan, as you mentioned, Congress made the right decision early on in passing the CARES Act, which was the largest economic stimulus package in U.S. history. But there were a number of people who were excluded from the CARES Act. Could you talk about who was excluded and what the impact of that exclusion has been on them?
Yeah, the CARES Act, in our analysis and other researchers who have been looking at this, is found to be, so important and really, temporarily successful for families that were able to receive it. But we know that unfortunately, some, even though they were technically eligible, were at risk of not receiving it. There were about 12 million individuals identified who were at risk of maybe not receiving the stimulus check, even though they were eligible for it. And that's because they may not have filed taxes recently because they have such low incomes that they were not required to do so, that it required a lot of extra steps and the onus on the families themselves to figure out that they actually needed to apply for it. That put them at risk for not receiving it. But there were also a number of folks who were just explicitly left out of the legislation when it was passed. So that ranged, across a couple different population groups. We saw high school and college students left out of the stimulus checks if they were over the age of 17 and still claimed as dependents for tax purposes, which most of them were because they're in school by their families. They were left out of the checks right at the same time that they were, facing, rapidly increasing costs with having to switch to virtual learning overnight and all of these things. We know some, and that was about 10 million 17 to 24-year-olds across the country who were left out. We know another 5 million older adults with serious health issues also were left out of the stimulus checks, again, because they're claimed as dependents. They can't live alone in many instances. They and their carers did not receive emergency assistance for them. And one of the biggest populations that was excluded was children and adults in immigrant families, and about 15 million, it's estimated, individuals in immigrant families were left out. And this, most of these kids would have been U.S. citizen children, but the exclusions were particularly harsh here because if just one adult in the family did not have a Social Security number, no one in the family, regardless of, citizenship status or green card status, were able to receive the payment. And so that has, huge implications for families in every state.
What should a new stimulus package look like? And we only have a minute, Megan Curran. I mean, you have, since the beginning of the pandemic, enormous wealth inequality. The wealth of U.S. billionaires has surged $931 billion. And yet, when you look at the number of people who've not only plunged into poverty, but hunger, how do you correct this? It was seen as also an enormous corporate bailout.
Yeah, I think what we need to recognize is that, we need to get more cash to families, and it needs to be accessible to as many families as possible without exclusions, and it needs to be consistent. We know that, another one-time check, while very welcome for many families, isn't going to be enough. Continuing unemployment benefits, the $600 top-up weekly payments, along with the expansions that included those who are usually not covered, need to be continued. We need to get regular cash assistance, on a monthly basis, if not more frequent, if possible, to families who are not covered by unemployment. And we need to make sure that there are other protections in place, increased access to food for kids. You can increase the SNAP benefit levels. You can put in more housing protections so that there's rent relief and protections against evictions. And basically, you just need to make sure that families know that they can count on this for the duration of the crisis, because we're seeing with, continued unemployment claims and continued surges in cases, this crisis is not going away right now. And so the relief needs to be in place for as long as families need it.
Megan Kern, I want to thank you for being with us at the Center on Poverty and Social Policy at Columbia University. We'll link to your report on increasing poverty in the U.S. during the pandemic. And a reminder, this Tuesday, November 3rd, election night, Democracy Now! Will air a 3-hour election night special from 9 p.m. Eastern to midnight. We'll be covering results from the presidential election to congressional and state races, as well as ballot initiatives. You can watch it at DemocracyNow.org, or you can ask your station to run it, as many are across the country. That does it for our broadcast. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.